Hello, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Nicole. Thanks for hanging out to the end of the day. I hope I can make the next hour interesting, talking about philosophy and its intersections with conservation. So I did kind of an independent project, but I worked in partnership with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I titled my project, Navigating the Moral Frontiers of Conservation, Assessing and Building Ethical Capacity in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But first, I want to introduce you to third grade now. So this is me on my first day of third grade. I'm holding up fingers because that's what I did every year on the first day of school. And at this time, I was very into Cher, but not just any Cher, 70s Cher. So I had platform sandals, I had my bell bottoms, had lots of glitter on, long straight hair. So super into Cher. But also my first day of third grade, I was really excited because it meant that we finally got to study space. And I had been reading about space all summer at the library and couldn't wait for our unit on the solar system. So this unit rolls around, and the first day of our unit, we watch a video on the solar system. And as soon as the video is over, I raise my hand and I ask our science teacher, Mrs. Finch, does space have an end? And she looks at me kind of puzzled, and then I clarify. Okay, so if I'm floating around in space, and I don't have to worry about breathing or eating or anything, and I can live forever and float forever, would I hit some kind of end to space? And I'll never forget what she told me. She told me to stop asking silly questions because this was science. And so, I know. So this isn't a story about how you shouldn't tell kids that, because then they'll talk about it 25 years later. Or like every day to my parents and my wife. But it's really about an age-old dichotomy that has done nothing but impoverish the way that we see and understand the world. And this dichotomy is between philosophy and science. So we tend to think of science as objective, philosophy as subjective accounts of our experience. Science deals in facts, philosophy deals in values. One's more tangible and one's more nebulous. But this dichotomy does nothing but marginalize philosophy, and then it ends up serving both disciplines poorly. So here's my third grade question, which I've matured a little bit. I was really asking if the universe is infinite. And we can think about how that question can guide our science to wonder what is beyond the solar system. And then our science can guide our philosophy when we want to know what infinite is. Would we even know what infinite is if we've seen it? Have we ever seen it? So this kind of speaks to the relationship between philosophy and science, and more specifically, the philosophy is cosmology, and then the science is astronomy. And then these together, it's really the philosophy of science, which is our attempt to understand what science is and how it works. So that's philosophy and science, but what about conservation? So something about conservation seems to make it categorically different from other sciences like astronomy or chemistry or biology. These are all headlines from the last year or so, but really the last few months. And I thought they did a great job of showing us what we have to contend with in modern conservation. So we have social justice issues, we have development and climate change issues. This one, Alex shared with me this one, which is, should children join the killing in New Zealand's war on invasive species? We have personhood movements for animals, but also land. We have human-wildlife conflict issues. We have questions about how we should treat individuals as individuals versus just them being members of a larger population or their species. And this one was from just this week. Feds approved Colorado's plan to reintroduce wolves and kill them in some cases. So if that's not ethically charged, I don't know what is. So without even reading these stories, we can gain a sense that there's no outright scientific or technical solution to these problems. It would seem that we need an additional tool or an additional lens to make sense of these kinds of things in conservation. So that brings me to some questions I had at the beginning of my project. What I just mentioned, what makes conservation philosophically different from other disciplines? How do conservationists navigate the philosophical underpinnings of their work? And how can philosophy guide our conservation? So I took those questions and I designed my project around those. So these are my goals and objectives as I originally wrote them, and we don't have to read through them. But they evolved quite a bit. But broadly speaking, I wanted to gain a deeper understanding of the conservation ethic of the Fish and Wildlife Service through interviews. And then I wanted to create some sort of tool that helped conservationists navigate the philosophical dimensions of their work. So that was my little introduction, and this is where we're headed. I'm going to give you a crash course in philosophy because I think it will deepen your understanding of my project. I'm going to talk to you about the Fish and Wildlife Service and the context that we're in, methods, and then I'm going to go into results and conclusions. Okay, so I want to get you anchored and oriented in philosophy. So we'll start with a few definitions. So philosophy is an attempt to ask and answer fundamental questions about life or meaning or values that cannot be answered by science. So philosophy has been around for as long as humans have been able to think. It's just us trying to make sense of our world. And ethics is a branch of philosophy that attempts to answer basic questions about how humans should understand and relate to the world, also called moral philosophy. So when we see words like should or ought, that should trigger us to think about the ethics of our work. And then an important, maybe the most important component or idea in ethics is this idea of moral standing, deserving of some degree of moral consideration, respect, or concern. And although not mutually exclusive, I think since we talk about intrinsic and instrumental value in conservation, as we're getting used to the ideas, we can think of them as kind of the same, moral standing and intrinsic value. Well, okay, so this is a map of philosophy. We're not going to read it or go through it, but I want us to kind of get a sense of where we are in philosophy. So we're going to go by color. So in philosophy, we study history and traditions. So we'll study philosophy from all over the world and then also through time. And then we're studying metaphysics there in green, which is the fundamental study of nature. So we're asking questions like, what sorts of things exist and how do we know that they exist? Epistemology is the philosophy of knowledge, where we might wonder, how do we know that we know something? Logic in gray is the study of correct reasoning. So this is where we'll practice building our conclusions off of sound premises. And then in blue, we have value theory. So my story at the beginning of class was the philosophy of science. We're kind of hugging metaphysics and epistemology. But for the remainder of my presentation, we're going to be in value theory, wondering what sorts of things have value and how we should interact with that value, specifically moral theory. So now we're going to dive into moral theory. Okay. So moral theory can be broken down into 4 branches. Metaethics concerns itself with the meaning of ethical terms or theoretical questions about the nature of ethics itself. So we might ask questions like, what does moral even mean? Does it exist? How do we know what moral is or what morality is? Descriptive ethics is the study of values in a neutral and objective way. So we're interested in what moral beliefs people actually hold. And in a lot of ways, our social science lives in descriptive ethics. We're going out in a community and we're not passing judgment, we're not critiquing, we're just interested in understanding how people feel or what they value. Okay, and then applied ethics deal with specific situations or practices. So like, what should we do in a specific situation? So when we think about biomedical ethics in medicine or some other disciplines that have an applied ethic, that's where those practices live. And then the last branch here, normative ethics, we're interested in critically reflecting on what is true, correct, rational, or good. What is morally right? And in a lot of ways, this is the answer to my first question, which is what makes conservation philosophically different from other disciplines. And that's that as conservationists, we're tasked with constantly answering these questions for ourselves. We have to figure out what's true, correct, or rational, or good for the well-being of the planet, for the well-being of people, for the well-being of animals. And in this way, conservation is unavoidably normative. It's value-laden. It has to live in normative ethics. So under normative ethics, we've got 3 ethical theories. So utilitarianism is an ethical theory that holds that something is morally right if it produces the greatest good for the greatest number. So here, when we're trying to figure out the rightness or wrongness of our actions, we're thinking about the consequences as utilitarians. Virtue ethics purports that the central focus of ethics should be on what kind of people we want to be. So what virtues or what character should we cultivate to be those kinds of people? So maybe a virtue ethicist is focusing on compassion or care or trustworthiness. That would be virtue ethics. And then they filter what they're going to do through that character lens. And then deontology, this is where, if you're familiar with Kant's philosophy, this is what he's saying. So Kant in deontology holds that moral rules and principles are at the heart of morality. So questions like, what principle should I follow? So follow the golden rule, never lie, those sorts of things. That's how a deontologist might decide what they should do. So just a quick review, utilitarian is consequence, virtue ethics is character, and deontology is principles or rules. I want to just note here that it's not like one of these are right or wrong or better or worse. They're just more and less applicable in different scenarios, and they have strengths and weaknesses that can have real implications in our conservation work. One final note on this slide, moral subjectivism and relativism. So these are both skeptical views of ethical theories. These views are skeptical that we can even try to know what is morally good or morally right. Moral subjectivism holds that morality is entirely personal. So what you believe is right or wrong can be different from what I believe, but that's personal to you and it's personal to me, and so we don't really have a disagreement because it's feelings. Relativism holds that morality varies between individuals and cultures. So we can't really critique what another culture or another community is doing. So both of these positions are quite attractive for obvious reasons. It, can help us think about the world in kind of this like to each his own sort of way. But both positions are hard to hold well because they make it impossible for us to object to really bad things. If everything is subjective and relative, then we can't critique really anything, right? So, and granted, I'm going to do a little side note here with all of this. there's philosophers that always have another way to think about it, or, you know, challenges to these things. But for the purposes of my presentation and keeping it simple, I'm rejecting moral subjectivism and relativism and proceeding under normative ethics. Oh, okay. There we go. Okay. So now we've talked about ethical theories, and another important component in ethics is value paradigms. So these value paradigms help us organize our beliefs around who or what has value in the world, and then how we should interact or relate with that value. So anthropocentrism is here in the smaller circle. It's a human-centered view of nature, holding that only humans have moral value or standing or worth. Biocentrism is a layer out. It's a life-centered view of the world, holding that life has value, life has moral standing. Ecocentrism is a systems-focused view of the world, holding that ecological wholes, like ecosystems, have moral standing. So, of course, there's some beyond this, but these are the three basic ones. And when we're thinking about our moral community, it can have real implications for not only how we do our conservation work, but how we interact with each other, who maybe have the same value paradigm or a different one from us. So important to generally be aware of these. All right, so that was our crash course in philosophy. Now I'm going to move on to a little context for the Fish and Wildlife Service. So I worked with the Fish and Wildlife Service because I already worked there, and my supervisor was really supportive of me developing this kind of weird project. So it's a bureau in the Department of Interior, federal bureau. And the important things to know is that the Fish and Wildlife Service manages national wildlife refuges and wetland management districts. They administer the Endangered Species Act, and they're the only agency whose main focus is fish and wildlife in the American Public's trust. So no other agency has that specific focus. Okay, so those were the basics, and now I'm going to talk about a few different landscapes that the service fits within, and then push it in the philosophical direction. So we don't need to see the details of the map, just to know that there's national wildlife refuges across the country. So we have a large heterogeneous landscape that's contending with climate change, habitat fragmentation, biodiversity loss, and other pressures. So putting on our philosophy hats, do we have the tools to navigate a conservation triage? So things like climate change and biodiversity loss are often framed in this crisis mentality, which might make us think about a triage. And in triages, you have limited resources and you often have to make ethical judgment calls. So that's the question, do we have the tools to make those ethical judgment calls? Here's a little history. So the service came about following the formation and reorganization of several different agencies. I thought these were kind of the main ones. The Commission of Fish and Fisheries, National Fish Hatcheries came out of that, and that eventually, parts of it anyways, were absorbed into the Department of Commerce. And then the section of economic ornithology was under the Department of Agriculture, and they were investigating bird migrations in relation to farming. And so those were kind of reorganized, and then eventually in 1956, the Fish and Wildlife Service was established. In 1966, we see the National Wildlife Refuge System lands consolidated under the service. And then in 1997, so pretty recently, we see conservation included into the mission of the Fish and Wildlife Service explicitly. Okay, so here's our question. How should the service reckon with its ethical legacy? So this is Teddy Roosevelt with a pelican on Pelican on Pelican Island, which eventually became a national wildlife refuge. But so this land was stolen indigenous land. So the question is, how should the service reckon with that information? Should it give the land back like we're seeing the service do it like in Montana a couple years ago with the National Bison Range? Is it a co-leadership model? So these are ethical questions that we have to think about when we're learning about the agency's history. All right, moving on to social and cultural landscape. So I'm going to talk about it inside of the service and then outside of the service. So interestingly enough, we had this thing called the values journey happen at work where, we did surveys and focus groups, and they wanted to understand our agency values as they saw fitting right up under our mission. So this is what they came up with, this list. And it's interesting to think about values in the way that we know them in our program, CLTL, and then in the service, these values are considered collective expectations. So interesting to think about how we might demonstrate stewardship in the workplace and in our applied conservation work, and how we define those words could have broad implications for that. No philosophy question on this one. Okay, so outside of the agency, we see the public's values evolving. So most of us probably know America's wildlife values. An increasing number of mutualists in our country, but for this one, I'm focusing on public trust in governing institutions, noticing that the federal government is enjoying the least amount of trust. The question asked was, overall, to what extent do you trust your federal government to do what is right for your country? So we have to ask, who determines what is right? Do we trust the public to know what is right? What role should trust play in conservation? Hopefully you're starting to get a sense of the ethical dimensions that can show up here. All right, political landscape. So the reality of working for a federal agency is that your focus, your priorities can change every 4 to 8 years. Previous administration focused a lot more on expanding access, and this administration seems to be focusing more on investing in conservation. The last one, economic landscape. So the service receives other allocations from the government in its budget, but it also receives money from the Pittman-Robertson Act, taxes firearms for wildlife conservation, Dingell-Johnson Act, taxes fishing equipment to restore fisheries. I'm simplifying there, but generally that's what happens. So we can see that hunters and anglers are really forefront here. And this is really one of the central tenets of the North American model for wildlife conservation. Here's the question, does the service's funding sources create ethical dilemmas? And I don't mean in the sense of hunting or fishing being unethical. I mean in the sense that, especially what's been happening recently when there's gun violence, gun sales go up, and that money creates a bigger pot for the Fish and Wildlife Service to do conservation. Are we okay with that, or should we be concerned, or is that just the way it is? So these are important questions to ask. Okay, so you had your crash course in philosophy, you had your Fish and Wildlife Service background, and I'm going to talk to you about my method. So for assessing and building ethical capacity in the service, I thought of myself as this little gadfly. So the gadfly is something that Socrates talks about in Plato's dialogues. And Socrates says, like, I'm not engaging with people, I'm not like challenging them, I'm not playing a devil's advocate. I'm just kind of teasing them and poking them and maybe annoying them a little bit to try to understand what their philosophical views are. So that's how I thought of myself in my interviews. I'm not engaged in full philosophical debate, but I'm just trying to really understand people. And this comic was so cute. Gadflies, by the way, buzz around livestock and annoy them. Okay, so I conducted semi-structured interviews and I had 20 volunteers. I started with the Division of Scientific Resources because that's my program. And I thought that by starting with people I was comfortable with, they would feel open in speaking to me. And then I could also, work on my interview skills and receive feedback from them. So that's where I started and probably why I have more of those participants than the others. And then from there, I had word of mouth recruitment. So after people spoke with me, then they referred me to other people that they also thought might talk to me. So I talked to 8 people or 8 programmatic areas. I talked to 2 people outside of the Fish and Wildlife Service, which I didn't include here. I talked to people from anywhere from 1 to 3 hours, and I had more interest than time at the end of the day by the time I figured out what I was doing for my project and everything. So I know it's a small sample size, but I think it was a good start to hopefully more work in this direction. Okay, so this is a screenshot of what participants received before they even agreed to speak with me. So we have an introduction and I let them know that their responses are confidential. I provide a couple of definitions so that we're hopefully working with some sense of the same understanding. And then here are my questions. So one, I wanted to know what experience folks had with philosophy or ethics in a more formal sense, like in a classroom or continuing education or something like that. And then I wanted them to tell me about a moral dilemma in their conservation work. And I wanted this to feel like a story so that I could go into the story and kind of pull out the ethical underpinnings of what they were talking about. And then I asked these really broad normative questions. What should the goals of conservation be? How should we relate to nature? To whom and to what are we responsible for in our conservation work, if anything? And those were, again, to kind of get at theories and paradigms. And then the 6th question, I asked people to reflect on their lived experiences and identity and how those shaped their personal ethic. And I had this question instead of any sort of demographic questions. And I did that for a couple reasons. I wanted people to feel really open in talking about me or talking to me. And this is because there can be real professional danger, I think, in expressing ethical opinions that are different from your agency. So I didn't want to even really touch on that. I wanted people to feel really comfortable talking to me. And I realized that in asking this question instead of demographic questions that I was kind of forfeiting my ability to compare those demographic responses to responses I got. But maybe down the road, there's another way that I could work that and do a better job at that. But for now, I just really wanted it to be an open conversation. So after completing my 20 interviews, I began crafting a code book of themes. I won't have time to go through all of those themes or results. I'm just going to focus on a few. So these are my key findings, and I'm thinking of ways that ethics can increase capacity, provide context, and improve clarity. So before we dive into those, I want to give you a sense of the sorts of things that people were talking about. So the number in the box corresponds to the size, and then these are unique mentions of these subjects. So if someone told me several stories that touched on disagreement with leadership, I marked it each time they told me a unique story, not just each time that one person told me that story. Okay, so we have balancing human and nature needs as a moral tension. Challenges of modern life, that might be like, I have to drive 100 miles to work every day as a conservationist. I don't know how I feel about that. endangered species over thriving species, favoring endangered species over thriving species, favoring the population over the individual, disagreement with leadership, which was an interesting one, inclusivity and access, ethical issues around conservation framed as a crisis discipline, punitive hierarchies. This might be moral tensions relating to favoring game over non-game species or mammals over amphibians, something like that. Killing versus letting something die, animal welfare, and then native over invasive species, which I expected to be a lot bigger, but I could not get any invasive biologist to talk to me. So, but that's a very interesting one. They're like, no way. So this is generally how I'm representing my results here in this presentation. So the title of the slide is going to be my theme. The bubbles are my sub-themes. And again, the numbers in the bubbles are unique mentions for each sub-theme. And then the quote corresponds to the main or the major sub-theme. Okay, so here, what I'm showing is that in terms of how people talked about where they feel like they got their conservation ethic origin, most people reference the field itself or people in the field as being gods or rock stars, and they helped them develop their conservation ethic. Not philosophy so much, a little religion, and then some mentors, and then this idea of an intelligence of nature. So again, these results are related to the capacity component of ethics. So these are what I identified as barriers to ethics integration, the biggest one by far being a lack of philosophy experience. This person saying that their academic background in biology felt very divorced from the world of ethics. Okay, only 2 interviewees had training in philosophy or ethics, and this is consistent with research in graduate programs that normally don't offer these kinds of classes. And most respondents' conservation ethic was shaped by conservation itself. So in this sense, ethics can increase our capacity to understand and address the normative dimensions of our conservation work. So normative, I mentioned conservation is unavoidably normative. It deals in values that have real consequences and cause harm in wild cases for people, animals, and the planet. Conservation biology doesn't equip us with the tools to navigate those normative dimensions of conservation. So when I'm talking about capacity, I'm not just talking about knowledge or like I did the crash course on philosophy. I'm not just talking about definitions, I'm talking about having the space to hold those conversations to deepen your philosophical understanding, because in the spirit of philosophy, that's really what it is. It's just having conversations and refining our views. So that's where I did the capacity piece. Okay, now moving on to the results that speak to context. So these are value paradigms expressed, and this is a great ecocentric quote. Ecosystems in themselves are stakeholders. We have to look at the health of the entire ecosystem and entire landscape. So that's ecological wholes have moral standing. A few biocentrists, a few people valuing life. And then the empty circle is anthropocentrism. I didn't have anyone communicate those kinds of views. Ethical theories. So lots of utilitarians, a lot of people focusing on the consequences of their actions to determine the rightness or wrongness of those actions. Deontology, principle focused, virtue ethics, less so. And this is a great utilitarian quote. Perfect. You have to live with yourself because you tell yourself the benefit to the species is worth the cost to the individuals. And again, I want to emphasize that it's not like utilitarianism is wrong. It's just that it has its strengths or weaknesses in different contexts. And So we might wonder what it means for an agency to be kind of overwhelmingly utilitarian. Okay, so responsibilities. So this is when I was asking people what they feel like they're responsible for or to in their conservation work. And a lot of people communicated that wildlife first mission, feeling like they needed to be a voice for wildlife. An interesting one, although I don't have time to go into it in this presentation, is a responsibility to correct mistakes of the past and a responsibility to naturalness. Okay. So this gets at context. So the majority of interviewees expressed ecocentric utilitarian views with a unique responsibility felt towards wildlife. And so these things, this value paradigm, ethical theory and responsibilities, these kind of commingle to establish normative theories or normative concepts in conservation, which are like umbrella concepts that can guide our conservation work. So examples of normative concepts might be the land ethic, which a lot of people, implicitly and explicitly aligned with that I spoke to, but they can also be like ecosystem services or even ideas like keystone species, so umbrella concepts. They can be buzzwords, but they can also be value-laden norms that become institutionalized in conservation policy and practice itself. So it's not to say that any of these normative concepts are bad, but sometimes they can be mistaken as truths when really they're just normative concepts anchored in values. And instead of taking them as truths, we should be philosophically engaging with them so that we can critically know when to apply them. So here we go. Ethics can provide us context, anchoring what we value, how we determine right from wrong, and what we're responsible for in frameworks that make it easier to understand ourselves and others, past, present, and future. So if we think about the land ethic, it makes sense that so many people align with the land ethic. He's like the modern, Aldo Leopold's like the father of modern wildlife management. But this ethic, it's very ecocentric ethic, but it's almost 100 years old at this point. And I wonder if that land ethic could have anticipated like some of the headlines I showed you at the beginning of our presentation. So I'm not saying, like throw the baby out with the bathwater, like throw out the land ethic, it's no good. I'm saying maybe we need something else. Maybe we need to not apply it blanketly. Okay, so now we're moving on to the clarity that ethics can bring. So here's the barriers theme again, but this time I'm focusing on fact, value, perceptions. So that's where the quote is from. If the value doesn't come from humans, then how do you work with it? So there's confusion around this fact, value, perceived dichotomy. And then this is an interesting one. So I tried to understand how people were reasoning through ethical dilemmas, and most of the time it was with science. So this is another great quote. If I could wave a magic wand and get rid of extinction, I don't think I would do that because that's not how nature works. So there's a lot there in terms of like, it's everything natural, good, and all of this, but the tools that people are using to navigate the ethical underpinnings of their work are scientific tools, which don't do a great job because then they lead us into these like, what do we do with that, Okay, so moving on to this, clarity is a key finding around the fact-value dichotomy, and I'm going to use a figure here. So this is something that I also had confusion on, and even more broadly, confusion on the relationship between ethics and conservation. And so I've been trying to think of a visual way that I could represent this. So we'll start, but if anyone has any ideas on how I can improve upon it, or yeah, I'm open to it. So here we go. So let's start with facts. So without science, all we have is like a bunch of facts, and they could be, you know, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. It could be, if I drop this water bottle, it'll fall. Humans share DNA with apes. We just have all these different facts. Now, if I apply reason, and that reason could be the scientific method, then I end up with science, or my scientific theories. So in science, these theories are the highest level of knowing or explanation, right? You don't get higher than that in science. And then when we have these theories, whether it's heliocentrism or theory of gravity or theory of evolution, then we have a place to work from. And then we have a place where we can take in additional facts and we can communicate with each other around our theory instead of just trying to organize and work with a bunch of random facts. Okay, so now thinking about values in a similar way. So without ethics, we just have a bunch of values. And in a lot of ways, social science can come in here and help us organize our values, you know, gather the values and make sense of them. So the values could be, to use the wolf fact example, values might be like, wolves are an important predator in the ecosystem. Wolves belong on the landscape because I believe in the American West. Wolves deserve to be treated with respect because they're sentient. So these are all different values around wolves. But when I apply reason, philosophy, then I end up with ethics or ethical frameworks. So in this way, ethics keeps our values accountable through reason. Okay, so the reason that we apply to our values is really no different than the reason that we apply to our facts. In philosophy, we're talking, we have philosophical thought experiments, we're reflexive equilibrium, we're comparing and contrasting different scenarios, we're trying to isolate variables. So we're subjecting our values through the rigor of reason to come up with our ethical theories. And that's how we organize our values. So in this sense, ethics is the framework through which we can provide clarity on the role that values play in our conservation. So this dichotomy then would seem to not hold as much water if we're not just working kind of haphazardly with these values, but we bring them into a place where we move them through reason. Okay. Now moving on to my deliverables. So all of the previous results and insights that I shared with you shaped my deliverables, but I think this one maybe shapes them the most. And I counted it as an opportunity for ethics integration, which is that a lot of people communicated that they liked having these conversations. Philosophy is fascinating. So yeah, I think that this speaks to the idea that most of my interviews were word of mouth. I had to turn people down at the end because I didn't have time to talk. And then a lot of people spent like 3 hours of their workday talking to me about these things. So this led me to pivot away from the toolkit that I mentioned at the beginning and towards a reflection tool that would allow these sorts of conversations to continue on without me. So this is a story map I made. That's my reflection tool. And you'll notice I start with those broad normative questions, and then I go into kind of the background of the relationship between ethics and philosophy. And I know it's going fast and we won't have time to watch the whole thing, but then I go right into a philosophical thought experiment where I ask people to reflect on a conservation hero. And then think about what makes that person a good conservationist. So making a list. And then I want them to reflect on that list of good things in light of ethical theories, which I later introduced, so that people can kind of gain a sense of what ethical theory they tend to lean into. And then it goes into the paradigms a little bit, and then another little thought experiment, and then some additional resources. But I wanted to mention that this is going to be hosted on the Human Dimensions website in the Fish and Wildlife Service, because there's a relationship between social science and ethics that's really interesting. So yeah, overall it's supposed to take like 5 or 10 minutes to go through, which was the feedback that I got from people. Like, whatever you create, everyone in the service is really busy and spread thin, make sure it's quick. So I figure if someone watches this and all they do is just like question things a little or think a little harder, then that's the goal. So within the story map, I have supplemental materials, and I have these they're not really lesson plans, just really topical exercises on a bunch of different people in conservation. So here, this one, I chose Aldo Leopold because we'd already been talking about him, but I have this picture and then I have a quote, and I don't have any other information about him because all I want you to do is think about what he's implying ethically and philosophically with his quote. So his quote is, examine each question in terms of what is ethically and aesthetically right, as well as what is economically expedient. The thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. So we've got our quote to work with, and then a few ground rules. So like individually or with a group, reflect on this. Remember, the goal here is not to find resolution or agreement, rather share your views, come up with multiple answers, and then reflect on those answers, right? That's philosophy at its core. And then use the questions below to guide your discussion. So just an example question. What is a biotic community? How do we know where one begins and one ends? What does it mean to preserve or fail to preserve the integrity? Is preservation always good? Are there any circumstances wherein you wouldn't want to preserve? So this is just, even if someone like just opens this and just glances at it, I think that would be a really cool thing because nobody is really talking about this, especially at the service. And then beyond this, there's also a glossary with other resources. Okay, so this brings me to my recommendations. So, of course, like, use my reflection tool and formally normalize and support ethical discourse. There's some ideas for how that could look. Formally integrate ethical components into decision-making and planning processes. So there's a couple of things that the service is already doing where it would be so easy to insert ethics in. And the one I want to talk about a little bit more is the National Environmental Policy Act process, the NEPA process. So a few years back, the service actually contracted with a philosopher to create a stakeholder group because the service was getting ready to lethally remove barred owls to promote the survival of northern spotted owls in the Pacific Northwest. And they knew that lethal removal was going to be a moral issue for people, and they wanted to get ahead of it. So they hired this philosopher, and he created a stakeholder group with everyone from the Fish and Wildlife Service, the state agency, tribal members, veterinarians, animal rights activists, the public, all of these different people. And he gave them a crash course in ethics and philosophy, so they were kind of operating from the same definitions. And then he acted sort of like a philosophical facilitator, where he went beyond just understanding everyone's values, but then he put the values in an ethical framework and reflected them against, moral standing or these other things. So this was called an ethics-based policy dialogue. And then from there, he created an ethics brief, which was actually included in the NEPA process. And that was the first time that that's ever done. But if you read the NEPA Act, it alludes to values. It's not just talking about a compatibility determination's impact on the land or wildlife. It's talking about that act's impact on people and values, and that's the perfect opportunity to slip ethics. All right, conclusions. So these are more like philosophical conclusions, and maybe they'll be good jumping off points for us to have our question session, but here we go. So care should be taken to avoid confounding descriptive and normative ethics. So reminder, descriptive ethics is going out into the community and just understanding how people feel. So there's plenty of examples, I'm sure, I don't have to name them, where it would be really bad to mistake what the public wants for ethically sound. What's socially acceptable is not automatically ethically sound. So ethics can provide us with that tool that could come in between those things to critically reflect on what we're getting from our descriptive ethics or our social science, reflect them through this ethics lens. Second conclusion, practitioners should engage critically with both new and established norms in conservation. So I mentioned the land ethic as an established norm in conservation that I think we should take a second look at. But new norms, some aspects of new conservation strike me as doubling down on anthropocentrism. And I think that, well, one, then we're logically inconsistent, because most of us would not identify as anthropocentrists anymore, especially in this school, in this field. And so I think ethics can help us weigh the norms in our umbrella concepts and make sure that one, we're being logically consistent, and two, we're valuing what we really value instead of just working with, hey, sometimes new, just because something new is new doesn't mean it's better, that we should still be critical with it. Okay. Lastly, I didn't get to talk about this as much as I wanted to, but ethics ought to be explored as a potential therapeutic avenue through which to understand the difficult emotions associated with conservation work. So a lot of times my conversations with people, when we were talking about something hard that was an ethical dilemma, it was emotional. And in kind of picking it apart and trying to understand it, we were also able to work with the emotions. And this is another dichotomy between reason and emotion. So I think that there's some interesting things to be said here, and that ethics can kind of do a double job. It's my personal reflection. So philosophy isn't something you teach, it's something you do together. The spirit of philosophy is discourse, right? I mean, you read a lot, you contemplate, but really to grow your skill, you have to talk about things. And I realized early on in my project that this was going to be hard because the Fish and Wildlife Service is still mostly remote, so I wasn't running into people. And then this really wasn't my role in my interviews. So I think the personal growth for me happened when I had to just like say, okay, this is what I'm philosophically believing, so I'm gonna go with it and move from there. So remembering the spirit of philosophy. And then here's another one. People are generally good. They want to do good and want to do better. So this was my view. This was the view generally of people I spoke to. And I think that there's definitely something to be said here about, you know, working outside of your school or your program, your silo, your algorithm, whatever it is. I think that ethics can be a way that we can just try to really understand each other. Because if you're working with a philosophical or ethical framework, it's, when I was doing this anyways, it's like some of the other things just fall away. Like even if I disagreed with you ethically on something that you're doing or that you said, if I'm just really trying to understand you, I'm trying to understand your argument, trying to understand what shaped your values, I'm trying to understand everything about what you're saying, it's easier to relate to people, and then it's easier to talk to people. Okay, so I'm wrapping up. Okay. So this is my normative claim. If you don't leave here with anything, I hope you leave with this. Conservation should be, to the greatest extent possible, scientifically robust, socially acceptable, and ethically sound. And these are really the reasons, right? Like, this is modern conservation now, but especially this, animal sentience, the ability to feel, sapience, self-awareness, the ability to reason, and social life. It's really hard to be ethically sound and ignore these things. It's impossible. Climate change, like when we're thinking about ethical theories where we judge the rightness or wrongness of our action based on our consequences, and we have trouble predicting consequences, how are we so sure that our actions are right? And of course, this has to be integrated. So ethics is really the tool that can kind of bridge all of this together, because I think at the end of the day, most of us have gotten into this field because we care. And inherent in caring is wanting to be ethical, right? That's a principle of caring. All right, so most of you probably know about compassionate conservation. It's a great example of an applied ethic. So we didn't get a chance to talk about if conservation needs an applied ethic like medicine has, but some people are wondering about it and creating it. So the compassionate conservation movement, it's a virtue ethics approach. So it's a focus on character. And even if we disagree with it, it's a starting place to start to build other things from. PANWorks, People Animals Network, is a ethics think tank devoted to the well-being of people, animals, and the environment. And if you just want to read more generally about these topics, that's where to go. They post a lot of cool articles from all over the world. And with the best example of unintended consequences, your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. That's from Jurassic Park. Chaos theory. Well, that's it.